At 7 minutes past midnight on March 10, 1945, Staff Sergeant Hisao Kato stood on the roof of a factory warehouse in Tokyo's Koto ward, scanning the night sky. He was a spotter for the civilian air defense network. His job was to watch for American bombers and sound the alarm. He had done this duty for 6 months. He had seen the silver B-29s pass overhead at heights so extreme they left only thin contrails against blue sky. He had watched flak bursts explode thousands of feet below them, harmless black puffs that never touched the bombers. He had heard the propaganda broadcasts that called the American planes fragile, temperamental machines that caught fire and fell from the sky on their own. He had believed it. Every Japanese citizen had believed it. The newspapers printed stories about B-29 crews abandoning burning aircraft. Radio announcers described engine failures and crashes. The message was clear. The American bombers were impressive in size, but fundamentally flawed. They would not decide this war. Then Kato heard the sound. It was low at first, a distant rumble that grew steadily louder. He looked south toward the bay. The sky was dark, but not empty. Shapes moved against the stars. Dozens of shapes, then hundreds. The bombers were not flying at 30,000 feet tonight. They were coming in low, so low Kato could see their silhouettes clearly. B-29s, wing after wing of them, approaching in a stream that seemed endless. His hands shook as he reached for the alarm bell. By the time he rang it, the first incendiaries were already falling. The story of how Japan came to believe American bombers were fragile begins not in Tokyo, but in Seattle, where Boeing engineers were building the most complex aircraft in history and watching it fail repeatedly. The Wright A-3350 engines that powered the B-29 were temperamental, dangerous, and prone to catastrophic fires. In early 1944, less than 16 of the first 100 B-29s produced were rated as flyable. The engines overheated, cylinders failed. Magnesium components caught fire and burned at temperatures approaching 5,600 degrees. When a B-29 engine caught fire, it could burn through the main wing spar in seconds, causing the wing to fold and the aircraft to fall. On February 18, 1943, the second B-29 prototype crashed near Boeing Field in Seattle. Both engines on the left wing caught fire. Test pilot Edmund Allen tried to return to the airfield, but the fire spread too quickly. The bomber came down in a meat packing plant. Allen and his 10-man crew died. 20 workers in the plant died. A Seattle firefighter died fighting the blaze. The crash investigation revealed fundamental problems with engine cooling and the magnesium crankcase that turned engine fires into infernos. American newspapers reported the crash. The story reached Japan through neutral channels. Japanese intelligence analyzed the reports and concluded that American claims about the B-29's capabilities were exaggerated. The aircraft was too complex, too rushed into production. It would fail under combat conditions. Japanese propaganda broadcasts began emphasizing these weaknesses. Radio Tokyo told listeners that American bombers were catching fire over the Pacific, that crews were abandoning aircraft in terror, that Japan's air defenses would destroy any that reached the home islands. The propaganda was not entirely false. B-29s were catching fire. Crews were dying in mechanical failures. Between June 1944 and January 1945, of the 414 B-29s lost in operations against Japan, 267 were lost to engine fires, mechanical failures, and accidents. Only 147 were lost to enemy action. The mathematics favored the propaganda narrative. American bombers were more likely to be killed by their own engines than by Japanese defenders. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the propaganda ignored a crucial fact. American factories were fixing the problems, while Japanese defenders could not. In June 1944, Boeing sent a B-29 to the Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory in Cleveland. Engineers pulled the engines apart and identified specific failures. The cylinder heads did not dissipate heat adequately. The exhaust valves failed under sustained high power. Fuel distribution between cylinders was uneven, causing some to run lean and backfire into the magnesium supercharger. Engineers redesigned The cylinder heads, they changed the metallurgy of the valves. They added baffles to direct cooling air. They modified the cowl flaps. They replaced the uppermost 5 cylinders every 25 hours. They replaced entire engines every 75 hours. The fixes were expensive, time-consuming, and brutally labor-intensive. But they worked. By late 1944, B-29s were becoming reliable enough for sustained operations. The failure rate dropped. Crews learned to manage the engines carefully during takeoff, building airspeed immediately to maintain cooling airflow. Pilots described flight after takeoff as an urgent struggle for airspeed, not altitude. The aircraft remained difficult, demanding, unforgiving, but it flew. And more importantly, it flew at altitudes Japanese fighters could not effectively reach. The first B-29 raid on Tokyo launched from Saipan on November the 24th, 1944. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr. commanded the mission from the lead bomber, Dauntless Doty. 111 B-29s took off. Only 88 actually dropped bombs on the city. Weather over the target was terrible. Cloud cover obscured the primary target, the Nakajima aircraft factory. Most bombers had to bomb by radar. The results were poor. Only 24 bombers hit the intended target, but the raid sent a message. American air power had reached the home islands. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled from airfields around Tokyo. They climbed as hard as their aircraft would allow. Most reached 22,000 to 24,000 feet before their engines began losing power in the thin air. The B-29s flew 6,000 to 8,000 feet above them, silver shapes moving steadily through the sky, completely out of reach. Pilots pushed their throttles to maximum power. Their engines screamed. The controls felt mushy. Some fighters wallowed at the edge of their performance envelope, barely able to maneuver. A few pilots tried firing at extreme range. The rounds fell short. In Tokyo, civilians watched from the streets and rooftops. The bombers were clearly visible, tiny silver dots trailing white contrails. Flak bursts appeared below them, black puffs that looked insignificant at that distance. The bombers flew through the flak without changing course, without wavering. They looked invincible. But Japanese propaganda told a different story. Radio broadcasts, after the raid, emphasized that Japanese fighters had engaged the enemy, that anti-aircraft guns had scored hits, that several American bombers had been damaged or destroyed. The broadcasts did not mention that most B-29s returned safely to Saipan. They did not mention that Japanese fighters could not reach the bombers' altitude. They emphasized American losses and minimized American success. The pattern continued. Through December, B-29s raided Tokyo and other cities, flying at altitudes between 28,000 and 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters scrambled. Some reached the bombers and attempted attacks. A few B-29s were shot down. Most returned safely. The bombing results remained poor. High winds at altitude, later identified as the jet stream, carried bombs off target. Weather frequently obscured targets. Precision bombing from 30,000 feet proved nearly impossible. American commanders grew frustrated. They were losing bombers to mechanical failures and gaining little in return. Japanese civilians, meanwhile, saw something else. They saw American bombers that could be reached, if barely. They saw Japanese fighters attempting interceptions. They saw some B-29s go down. The propaganda continued to emphasize fragility. American bombers, the broadcasts said, were complex machines, prone to failure. Japanese defenders were learning to defeat them. Victory was still possible. But in the Mariana Islands, American commanders were reaching different conclusions. Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. He inherited a failing strategic bombing campaign. High-altitude precision bombing was not working. Weather defeated accuracy. The jet stream scattered bombs. Mechanical failures cost more aircraft than enemy action. Something had to change. LeMay studied the February 25th firebombing test. 231 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs in daylight at high altitude. The raid destroyed nearly 28,000 buildings. It was the most destructive raid yet conducted against Japan. LeMay saw the results and understood. Japanese cities were not like German cities. They were not built of stone and concrete. They were built of wood and paper. They would burn. Incendiary bombs would work better than high explosives. But high-altitude attacks still faced the jet stream problem. Winds aloft scattered the incendiaries before they could create mass fires. LeMay needed to attack from lower altitude where winds were calmer, but low altitude meant vulnerability. Japanese anti-aircraft guns could reach bombers at 5,000 to 10,000 feet. Fighters could intercept more easily. Flying low meant accepting higher losses. LeMay gambled that Japanese air defenses were weaker than American intelligence estimated. He believed Japan had few effective night fighters. He believed low-altitude attacks at night would succeed where high-altitude daylight raids had failed. He was risking his career, his reputation, and the lives of thousands of airmen on that belief. On March 9th, 1945, LeMay issued orders that shocked his crews. The next mission would be at night, at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. To increase bomb loads, B-29s would fly with most defensive guns removed. Only the tail gun would remain. Each bomber would carry approximately 7 tons of incendiary bombs, nearly double the standard load. The aircraft would be overweight, slow, and nearly defenseless. They would fly individually rather than in formation, dropping bombs on a target area marked by Pathfinder aircraft. The entire plan violated every principle of strategic bombing doctrine. It was desperate, radical, and possibly suicidal. Crews thought their commanders had lost their minds. Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold, radio operator on a B-29 named Starduster, wrote home that morning. His right blister gunner packed his belongings neatly on his cot. He told Barthold he was looking at his possessions for the last time. He did not expect to return. Major Sam Bakshes, flying from Saipan, understood what LeMay was attempting. The high-altitude campaign had failed. Low-altitude incendiary attacks were the last option before admitting defeat. If this raid succeeded, the war could be won from the air. If it failed, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan would be judged a failure. 334 B-29s launched that evening from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. 279 reached Tokyo and dropped their incendiaries. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived first, marking the target area with napalm bombs in a large X pattern. The X was centered on the Shitamachi neighborhood, Tokyo's densely populated working-class district near the docks. Following aircraft simply aimed for the burning X. Individual fires coalesced within minutes. The wind that night gusted between 17 and 28 miles per hour. Strong enough to spread flames, but not strong enough to qualify as the natural windstorm required for a technical firestorm. The fires created their own wind. Superheated air rose rapidly, drawing in surrounding air at ground level. The effect created hurricane-force winds that spread flames block by block, building by building. By 14 minutes after the first bombs fell, Tokyo's fire department conceded defeat. The fires were beyond control. Within an hour, the conflagration spread beyond the target area. Temperatures in some locations reached 1,800 degrees. Asphalt liquefied. Metal glowed red. The heat sucked oxygen from the air. People who did not burn suffocated. People who sought shelter in buildings burned when the structures collapsed. People who fled toward canals found the water boiling. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned that night. Approximately 100,000 civilians died. Over 1 million became homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, more devastating than Dresden, more deadly than either atomic bombing that would come later. Staff Sergeant Kato, the air defense spotter who rang the alarm, survived. His factory warehouse stood at the edge of the target area. He watched the city burn for hours. He watched people fleeing through streets turned into corridors of fire. He watched buildings collapse into ash. He watched the sky turn orange, then red, then black, as smoke blocked the stars. When dawn came, he walked through his neighborhood. Every building was gone. Every street was covered in ash and debris. Bodies lay everywhere, burned beyond recognition. The smell of death permeated everything, and Kato understood something that Japanese propaganda had obscured. The American bombers were not fragile. They were not failing. They had just destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo in a single night, flying low enough that he could see their shapes clearly, delivering destruction that no amount of propaganda could deny or minimize. The B-29s returned to the Marianas. 14 aircraft were lost during the mission, shot down, ditched, or destroyed by accidents. 90 American airmen died. It was a loss rate of 4.6%, exactly what LeMay had predicted. Compared to the destruction inflicted on Tokyo, the losses were acceptable. The raid proved that low-altitude incendiary attacks worked. Japanese air defenses could not stop them. Japanese propaganda immediately began minimizing the damage. Radio broadcasts acknowledged fires in Tokyo, but claimed they were under control, that casualties were light, that American bombers had suffered heavy losses. The broadcasts were lies. Everyone in Tokyo knew they were lies. The entire eastern section of the city was ash. Over 1 million people were homeless. The dead were beyond counting. But the propaganda continued because the alternative was admitting that Japan could not defend its cities, that American bombers could strike at will, that the war was already lost. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2 nights after Tokyo burned, 310 B-29s attacked Nagoya. The atmospheric conditions were less favorable. The fires never merged into a mass conflagration. About 2 square miles burned. It was still devastating by any measure except comparison to Tokyo. The next night, March 13th, Osaka's turn came. Cloud cover forced most planes to drop by radar, but the incendiaries did their work. 8 square miles of the industrial and port areas turned to ash. On March 16th and 17th, Kobe burned. The pattern was clear. American bombers were systematically destroying Japan's cities, and Japanese air defenses could do nothing to stop them. In the weeks following the March 10th raid, Japanese military leaders held emergency meetings in Tokyo. The discussions were frank, desperate, and classified. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, Vice Chief of the Army General Staff, reviewed damage reports from Tokyo. The numbers were catastrophic. Industrial production in the affected areas had stopped completely. Over 267,000 buildings destroyed. 16 square miles of the city flattened. Transportation networks disrupted. Water systems damaged. Electrical infrastructure demolished. The human cost was beyond calculation. Conservative estimates suggested 80,000 to 100,000 dead, but the true number would never be known because entire families had been incinerated, leaving no one to report them missing. Kawabe read reports from other cities. Nagoya damaged, Osaka burning, Kobe struck. American bombers were hitting Japan's urban industrial areas systematically, and the pace was accelerating. Intelligence analysts projected that if the raids continued at this intensity, every major city in Japan would be destroyed within 6 months. The home islands had no defense against this kind of warfare. Japanese fighters could not stop night attacks at low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns lacked the radar and fire control systems to target bombers effectively in darkness. Civil defense preparations were inadequate. Japanese cities, built primarily of wood and paper, were perfect fuel for incendiary weapons. The propaganda response was immediate and comprehensive. Radio Tokyo began broadcasting that the American attacks were acts of barbarism, that they targeted civilians deliberately, that they proved American moral bankruptcy. The broadcasts were correct on the facts, but beside them is strategic reality. American commanders had concluded that destroying Japan's dispersed cottage industries required area bombing of residential neighborhoods. Over 50% of Tokyo's industrial capacity was spread throughout homes and small workshops. Bombing those areas meant bombing civilians, but it also meant destroying war production. The moral calculation had been made at the highest levels. General Curtis LeMay later said that killing Japanese did not bother him. Getting the war over bothered him. Japanese newspapers printed stories about heroic firefighters battling the flames, about citizens helping each other survive, about determination to continue fighting. The stories were true as far as they went. Japanese civilians did show remarkable resilience. Firefighters did battle impossible fires. Communities did help their own. But the newspapers did not print what everyone could see. The fires were unstoppable. The destruction was comprehensive. The American bombers came back night after night, and nothing Japan did made any difference. On April the 7th, 1945, American forces invaded Okinawa. The island was 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. Its capture would provide bases for an even more intense bombing campaign and staging areas for the invasion of Japan itself. Japanese military planners understood that Okinawa's fall would be catastrophic. They threw every available resource into defending it. Kamikaze attacks intensified. The battleship Yamato sortied on a suicide mission with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Japanese ground forces fought with desperate ferocity. None of it mattered. American forces ground forward. The battle would last 82 days and cost both sides horrific casualties. But the outcome was never in doubt. While Okinawa burned, B-29s continued hitting Japanese cities. By May, the raids had reached industrial rhythm. Bombers struck every few days, destroying city after city. Yokohama burned on May the 29th. Over 450 B-29s attacked, escorted by over 100 P-51 Mustang fighters from Iwo Jima. It was one of the largest coordinated missions of the war. Japanese fighters attempted to intercept. 26 were shot down. Most never reached the bomber formations. B-29s were lost. None to ramming attacks or fighter action. 3 fell to anti-aircraft fire. 1 suffered mechanical failure. 1 collided with another bomber during formation assembly. In Japanese cities, civilians watched the bombers pass overhead in daylight now, flying at altitudes that anti-aircraft guns could reach, but rarely hit. The silver formations moved steadily across the sky, untouchable and unstoppable. Fighters occasionally rose to meet them, but were cut down by American escorts before they could attack the bombers. The psychological impact was crushing. Japan's air defenses had effectively ceased to exist. Haruo Onuma, a staff officer with the Japanese Army General Staff, wrote in his diary that the incendiary bombing's effect on the capital's organization and industrial disposition was very great. Main productive power stopped. The will of the people to continue the war decreased. Tokuji Takeuchi of the Ministry of Interior recorded that it was the great incendiary attacks on March 10th that made him realize defeat was inevitable. These were not propaganda statements. These were private assessments by military and civilian leaders who understood that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. The statistical reality was brutal. Between November 1944 and August 1945, B-29s flew over 33,000 sorties against Japan. They dropped approximately 170,000 tons of bombs. Conventional estimates suggest that between 300,000 and 330,000 Japanese civilians were killed in the bombing campaign. At least 8 million were left homeless. Approximately 60% of Tokyo was destroyed. Osaka lost 57% of its built-up area. Nagoya lost 52%. Kobe lost 56%. By summer 1945, there were few cities left to bomb. American losses during the campaign totaled 414 B-29s. 147 were lost to enemy action, primarily anti-aircraft fire, and a small number to fighters. 267 were lost to engine fires, mechanical failures, takeoff crashes, and other operational causes. The ratio confirmed what had been true from the beginning. The B-29's greatest enemy was its own complexity, but American factories produced enough aircraft and trained enough crews to absorb those losses and continue operations. Japan could not match American production capacity. Japan could not replace losses at American rates. Japan could not develop new technology fast enough to counter American advantages. The propaganda had promised that American bombers were fragile, that they would fail under combat stress, that Japanese ingenuity and fighting spirit would prevail. The propaganda was based on facts that were true in early 1944, but obsolete by late 1944. Yes, B-29 engines caught fire. Yes, crews died in mechanical failures. Yes, the aircraft was rushed into service before all problems were solved. But American engineers fixed the problems, while Japanese propaganda repeated outdated information. By the time B-29s began sustained operations from the Marianas, engine reliability had improved dramatically. Crews had learned to manage the aircraft's quirks. Maintenance procedures had been refined. The bomber that attacked Japanese cities in 1945 was not the same aircraft that crashed in Seattle in 1943. Japanese intelligence failed to track these improvements. Reports from early Baiki B-29 operations in China emphasized mechanical failures. Intelligence analysts assumed those problems would continue. They did not account for American industrial capacity to identify and fix engineering issues at scale. They did not understand that American doctrine allowed for iterative improvement, for acknowledging failures and implementing solutions. Japanese propaganda seized on early failures and promoted them as permanent characteristics. The result was a strategic miscalculation that left Japan unprepared for what the B-29 actually became. By May 1945, Japanese commanders stopped contesting B-29 raids, except under the most favorable conditions. Fighter units received orders to preserve aircraft and pilots for the expected American invasion. The losses were too high, the results too limited. Sending fighters against B-29 formations, escorted by P-51s, was suicide that achieved nothing. Better to save pilots and aircraft for attacking invasion ships and supporting ground defenders. It was an admission of complete defeat in the air war. On June 15, 1945, 444 B-29s attacked Osaka. Not a single Japanese fighter rose to intercept. American bomber crews flew over the city unopposed. They dropped their incendiaries and returned to base without seeing enemy aircraft. The skies over Japan belonged to the Americans now. Japanese commanders had effectively conceded air superiority. They could no longer defend their cities. They could no longer protect their citizens. They could only wait for the invasion and hope that ground fighting would somehow turn the tide. The official Japanese report on air defense operations from April through June 1945 documented the collapse. In 3 months, Japanese fighter units lost over 300 aircraft attempting to defend against B-29 raids. Most losses came from mechanical failures during high-altitude operations, accidents during emergency landings, or combat with American escort fighters. Only a small percentage of losses resulted in B-29s destroyed. The kill ratio was approximately 1 B-29 for every 8 Japanese fighters lost. The mathematics were unsustainable. The report concluded that conventional fighter defense of the home islands was no longer feasible. Japanese fighters could not reach altitudes where B-29s operated effectively when they tried high-altitude attacks. When Americans switched to low-altitude attacks, Japanese night fighter capabilities proved inadequate. The introduction of American escort fighters made even desperate ramming attacks nearly impossible. In Tokyo, civilians experienced the transformation of war from distant concept to immediate reality. Early raids in November and December 1944 had seemed manageable. The bombers flew high, dropped bombs that missed targets, and departed. Casualties were relatively light. Damage was repairable. Life continued with modifications and privations, but continued nonetheless. After March 10th, everything changed. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in single nights. Hundreds of thousands became homeless. Food supplies collapsed as transportation networks were destroyed. Water systems failed, electrical power became sporadic, medical care overwhelmed, the dead could not be buried fast enough. Yoshiko Hashimoto survived the March 10th raid with her baby. Her mother, father, and sister died in the fires. She described watching her neighborhood burn while holding her child, surrounded by people screaming, running, trying to find safety where none existed. She described the heat that made breathing difficult, the smoke that blocked vision, the panic that turned streets into stampedes. She described finding her parents' home the next morning and discovering only ash and bones. She described the weeks afterward, living in a makeshift shelter with thousands of others, searching for food, watching more bombers pass overhead, knowing they would return, knowing there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Stories like Hashimoto's multiplied across Japan through spring and summer 1945. Every city that burned produced thousands of similar accounts. Every raid created new refugees. The psychological impact went beyond physical destruction. Japanese civilians had been told their military would protect them. They had been told American bombers were vulnerable. They had been told Japanese fighting spirit would prevail. The bombing campaign destroyed those narratives more thoroughly than it destroyed buildings. American psychological warfare operations exploited this gap between propaganda and reality. Starting in May, B-29s began dropping leaflets alongside incendiaries. The leaflets warned civilians that specific cities would be attacked in coming days. They urged evacuation. They explained that America was not fighting the Japanese people, but the military clique that had enslaved them. The leaflets promised that peace would free people from military oppression. They were written in Japanese by specialists who understood the culture and psychology. Some leaflets used traditional poetry forms. Others referenced Japanese history and values. The goal was to separate the Japanese people from their government, to create psychological pressure for surrender. The Japanese government implemented harsh penalties against civilians who kept the leaflets. Possession could result in arrest and imprisonment, but people kept them anyway. The leaflets were evidence that someone outside Japan understood their suffering. They were promises that the war would end. They were alternatives to propaganda that increasingly rang hollow as cities burned. B-29s dropped approximately 10 million propaganda leaflets in May, 20 million in June, 30 million in July. The tonnage of paper exceeded the tonnage of bombs dropped in some raids. American commanders understood that breaking Japanese morale was as important as destroying Japanese industry. By late July, American intelligence estimated that 60% of Japan's urban areas had been destroyed. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation networks were in ruins. The merchant marine had been sunk by submarines and air attacks. Food stocks were critically low. Oil reserves nearly exhausted. The blockade was complete. Japan could not feed its population. It could not fuel its remaining military forces. It could not rebuild what the bombers destroyed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff prepared for Operation Downfall. The invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin in November. Casualty estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead and wounded. Japanese casualties would be far higher. The invasion would be the bloodiest operation in military history. Then, on August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The weapons were delivered by the same aircraft that had been burning Japanese cities for 9 months. The same bombers that propaganda had called fragile. The same aircraft that Japanese fighters could not reach. The atomic bombs were only the final blow. The conventional bombing campaign had already broken Japan's ability to continue the war. The incendiary raids had destroyed the dispersed industries that supplied Japan's military. The blockade had cut off resources. The loss of air superiority meant American forces could strike anywhere at will. Japan faced not just defeat, but annihilation. Emperor Hirohito made the decision to surrender on August 15th, 1945. His radio broadcast to the Japanese people was the first time most civilians had heard his voice. He spoke in formal, archaic Japanese that many struggled to understand. He said, The war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He said the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. He said continuing the war would lead to the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. He ordered his subjects to endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. He did not use the word surrender, but everyone understood. On September 2nd, 1945, Japanese representatives stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the surrender documents. Above them, formations of B-29s flew overhead in final demonstration. The bombers that Japan had been told were fragile, that would fail under combat stress, that could not sustain operations. The bombers that had burned 60% of Tokyo, that had destroyed Japanese cities systematically, that had delivered atomic weapons. The bombers that had proven every piece of Japanese propaganda wrong. The transformation from propaganda to reality happened gradually, then all at once. In November 1944, Japanese civilians believed what they were told. American bombers were impressive but flawed. They caught fire frequently. They crashed without enemy action. Japanese defenders would learn to defeat them. By March 1945, after Tokyo burned, belief became impossible. By June, when B-29s flew unopposed over major cities, the propaganda had become a bitter joke. Staff Sergeant Hisao Kato, the air defense spotter who watched the March 10th raid begin, survived the war. He returned to what remained of his neighborhood in Koto Ward. His home was gone. The factory where he worked was ash. Most people he knew were dead. In interviews conducted decades later, Kato described the moment on March 10th when he saw hundreds of B-29s approaching at low altitude. He said he realized immediately that everything he had been told was a lie. The bombers were not fragile. They were not failing. They were coming to destroy his city, and there was nothing he or anyone else could do to stop them. He said the propaganda had prepared Japan for a war Japan could win. The reality was a war Japan had already lost. The statistical evidence supports Kato's assessment. Between November 1944 and August 1945, the 20th Air Force, flying from the Marianas, lost 414 B-29s. Of these, only 147 were lost to enemy action. The remaining 267 were lost to mechanical failures, engine fires, accidents, and other operational causes. The ratio of operational losses to combat losses was approximately 2-1. Japanese propaganda had focused on operational losses and presented them as combat victories. The narrative was that American bombers were so poorly built they destroyed themselves. The reality was more complex. American bombers did suffer high operational loss rates, particularly in early operations. The B-29 was the most complex aircraft of the war, rushed into service before all problems were resolved. The Wright R-33-50 engines were temperamental and prone to fires. But American industrial capacity allowed for continuous improvement. Problems identified in combat were addressed in factories. Engineering changes were implemented across the fleet. Maintenance procedures were refined. By mid-1945, the B-29 had become a reliable weapons system. Not perfect, but functional. Not invincible, but effective. Japanese propaganda never adjusted to this reality. It continued emphasizing early problems long after those problems had been largely solved. Intelligence reports from early China-based operations became the basis for propaganda that remained unchanged through the end of the war. The result was a fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities that left Japanese civilians unprepared for what actually happened. The cost of this miscalculation was measured in cities destroyed and lives lost. Tokyo suffered the most. The March 10th raid killed more people than either atomic bombing. The city's population dropped from approximately 6 million to 3 million as survivors fled to the countryside. Industrial production fell by 50%. Transportation networks collapsed. The city that had been Japan's political and economic heart became a landscape of ash and rubble. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama followed similar patterns. Each city burned. Each lost half or more of its built-up area. Each suffered casualties in the tens of thousands. Each contributed to the cumulative destruction that broke Japan's ability to continue the war. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the true cost. Families separated in fires and never reunited. Children orphaned when parents died in flames. Workers who lost not just homes, but entire neighborhoods, entire communities. The social fabric that held cities together dissolved in the firestorms. Survivors described a sense of unreality, of walking through familiar streets that no longer existed, of searching for homes that had vanished, of mourning people whose bodies would never be found because they had been incinerated completely. American bomber crews experienced their own form of psychological trauma, flying through anti-aircraft fire at low altitude, watching Japanese cities burn below, smelling burning flesh sucked into aircraft through ventilation systems. Some crew members wore oxygen masks at altitudes where they were not needed simply to avoid the stench. Some vomited during missions. Some had nightmares afterward. The psychological cost of killing civilians on such scale affected many who participated, though most did not speak publicly about it until decades later. Major General Curtis LeMay, who orchestrated the low-altitude incendiary campaign, addressed the moral implications directly. He said that if the United States lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal. He acknowledged that the raids deliberately targeted civilians. He justified them on grounds that ending the war quickly would save lives, overall, both American and Japanese. He argued that invasion of Japan would cost millions of casualties on both sides, far more than the bombing campaign killed. He maintained this position throughout his life, never expressing regret for decisions made. The debate over the morality of strategic bombing continues among historians. Some argue that targeting civilians was a war crime, regardless of strategic justification. Others contend that Japan's dispersed industrial structure made area bombing necessary to destroy war production. Some point out that Japanese military leaders had deliberately placed factories in residential areas to use civilians as shields. Others respond that this does not justify killing those civilians. The debate has no resolution because it involves questions of morality, proportionality, and the ethics of total war that resist simple answers. What is not debatable is the effectiveness. The bombing campaign achieved its strategic objectives. It destroyed Japan's dispersed industrial capacity. It broke civilian morale. It demonstrated that Japan could not defend its own territory. Combined with the submarine blockade, the campaign reduced Japan to near starvation by August 1945. The atomic bombs accelerated surrender, but conventional bombing had already made surrender inevitable. The B-29s' role in this campaign represented a revolution in warfare. For the first time, aircraft could strike targets thousands of miles from their bases, carrying tons of ordnance, operating at altitudes beyond effective defense, sustaining campaigns lasting months. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated that air power alone could destroy a nation's ability to make war. Whether it should remained a question. That it could was proven beyond doubt. Japanese military leaders recognized this reality by late spring 1945. Internal documents from June detail the collapse of air defenses and the impossibility of continuing resistance. These documents were classified and hidden from the public. They reveal that Japan's leadership understood the war was lost months before surrender. They continued fighting primarily because surrender was culturally unacceptable, because military honor demanded fighting to the end, because admitting defeat meant admitting that everything the war had cost was meaningless. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse. Japanese leaders could tell themselves and their people that they surrendered because of a weapon that could not be resisted, not because conventional bombing had already destroyed Japan's ability to fight. The propaganda about American bomber fragility served a purpose during the war. It maintained civilian morale when morale was critical. It gave people hope that Japan could still win, that sacrifices would be meaningful, that resistance would matter. When that propaganda collided with reality, on March 10th, When Staff Sergeant Kato watched hundreds of B-29s approaching at low altitude, when Tokyo burned for 16 square miles, the psychological impact was devastating, precisely because it contradicted everything people had been told to believe. After the war, occupation authorities interviewed Japanese civilians about their experiences. Surveys conducted in late 1945 found that approximately 70% of respondents said they had reached a point where they could not endure one more day of war. Most dated this moment to specific bombing raids on their cities. The raids destroyed not just buildings, but belief. Belief that Japan could win. Belief that military leaders knew what they were doing. Belief that propaganda reflected reality. The gap between what people were told and what they experienced became unbridgeable. The B-29 crews who flew these missions went home after the war and rarely spoke about their experiences. The aircraft itself became obsolete within a few years, replaced by jets that flew faster and higher. The strategic bombing doctrine, developed during World War II, continued to evolve, becoming the nuclear deterrence strategy of the Cold War. The lessons learned about air power's capabilities shaped military thinking for decades. But the specific story of how propaganda about American bomber fragility collided with the reality of Japan's burning cities faded into historical obscurity. Staff Sergeant Kato lived until 1998. He worked as a clerk in Tokyo, rebuilt, after the war, into a modern city that bore little resemblance to what burned in 1945. He rarely discussed his wartime experiences. When historians interviewed him in the 1980s, he described watching the bombers approach on March 10th and understanding in that moment that everything he had believed was wrong. He said the propaganda had been convincing because people wanted to believe it. Americans were the enemy. Their weapons had to be inferior. Japanese spirit had to be superior. When reality proved otherwise, when the bombers came in unstoppable waves and destroyed everything, the psychological shock was worse than the physical destruction. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Propaganda that relies on wishful thinking rather than accurate assessment creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. Japan told itself that American bombers were fragile because acknowledging their effectiveness meant acknowledging that the war was probably lost. The propaganda served short-term morale goals at the expense of strategic reality. When reality could no longer be denied, the gap between belief and truth was so wide that Japanese society fractured under the weight. American intelligence made mistakes as well, but corrected them through systematic analysis. When B-29 engines caught fire, engineers investigated and fixed the problems. When side-altitude bombing proved ineffective, commanders changed tactics. The willingness to acknowledge failures and implement corrections gave American forces adaptability that Japanese propaganda-driven rigidity could not match. This was not about inherent superiority. It was about institutional structures that allowed for learning and change versus structures that prioritized maintaining narratives over confronting reality. The irony is, the Japanese propaganda was partially correct. B-29s were fragile in early operations. They did catch fire frequently. They did suffer high loss rates from mechanical problems. But propaganda froze this reality in time and presented it as permanent truth. Reality changed. Propaganda did not. By the time hundreds of B-29s appeared over Tokyo at altitudes where they could be seen clearly, where their shapes and numbers were undeniable, the propaganda had become obviously false, and once people recognized one lie, they began questioning everything else they had been told. On March 10th, 1945, at 7 minutes past midnight, when Staff Sergeant Kato rang the air defense alarm and watched the first incendiaries fall, he was witnessing the moment when propaganda met reality and reality won. The B-29s, the Japanese civilians had been told were fragile and failing, were about to burn 16 square miles of Tokyo. and kill 100,000 people in a single night. They would return 2 days later to burn Nagoya, then Osaka, then Kobe, then city after city, until 60% of Japan's urban areas were destroyed. They would fly unopposed by June, masters of skies that Japan could no longer contest. They would ultimately deliver atomic weapons that ended the war. The story of Japanese propaganda about American bomber fragility is not primarily about aviation technology or strategic bombing doctrine. It is about the cost of substituting wishful thinking for accurate assessment. It is about the danger of propaganda that prioritizes morale over truth. It is about what happens when the gap between what people are told and what they experience becomes too wide to reconcile. Japan learned these lessons in fire and ash and counted the cost in hundreds of thousands of dead. The B-29 was never the invincible weapon that some American propaganda suggested. It remained complex, demanding, and dangerous to operate throughout the war. Crews continued dying in mechanical failures, even as the campaign reached its peak. But it was effective enough. It could fly far enough, carry enough bombs, operate at sufficient altitude, and sustain operations long enough to destroy Japan's ability to make war. That was what mattered, strategically. Whether Japanese propaganda chose to acknowledge that reality was irrelevant to the outcome. The bombers would come regardless. The cities would burn, whether propaganda admitted it or not. Reality always wins in the end. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.